This is a photo many people around the world have taken. Lake Louise is an iconic Canadian scene. It's perfectly framed, a clear turquoise lake that's guarded by mountains. This one over here, that's Mount Lefroy, and this one is Mount Victoria. Nestled between the two is a place called Abbot Pass. It's a spot that more than 100 years ago brought Swiss guides to Canada to help seasoned mountaineers and novice tourists alike summit the peaks of Mount Victoria and Lefroy. Abbot Pass is the access to these picturesque climbs, and it's named after Philip Stanley Abbot, who died from a fall during the first known attempt to scale Mount Lefroy in 1896. After his mountain tragedy, Swiss guides entered the picture, and tourism met mountaineering in Canada.
The Swiss guides working at Chateau Lake Louise were like, wow, we need something to facilitate more access, because if you're going from the chateau up to Victoria in one day, it's a big push.
Long day.
Yeah, and not everyone is capable of that. So they had this vision of building a hut, and the CPR supported that, and they built a hut at the pass.
Construction on a stone hut shelter began in 1922, and it opened a year later. The hut allowed more people to access Abbot Pass and the summits around it. Instead of an impossible climb, it became an introduction to mountaineering, something you could try out instead of work up to.
So this is an image from when I was there in July of 2012 with my dad on a trip, and it was a really easy walk down. I don't even really remember seeing much crevasses.
This is Kate Hanley. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary's Department of Geography.
I read an article about a book called Lou with a View, and it chronicled all the outhouses in the Canadian Rockies. And it named the outhouse at Abbot Hut the crown jewel. So I wanted to get up there and check it out. Yeah. The view is pretty exceptional. So my dad and I eventually got up there in 2012. On a guided outdoor trip, and it was incredible. I liked the scenery, obviously. It's a spectacular location, and I think the experience with my dad was really fun. It was the first time we've ever walked on a glacier. We got to do it together.
That was the first and last time Kate visited Abbot Hut. The historic stone refuge was dismantled in 2022, and that's only a few years after it was discovered that the once solid ground that it was built on had begun to thaw and crumble beneath it. It was a huge loss for the community. People who live in Alberta's Bow Valley call the mountains their backyard, so making these treks up to places like Abbot Pass is commonplace if you live in towns like Canmore or Banff. But over time, these classic routes are changing.
Having lived in the Bow Valley for a few years now, talking to friends and family and understanding well, what do these changes mean for you? And tons of people are drawn to this area because of what it can offer. It's world-class snow and ice routes, incredible skiing, things like that. And it was coming up in conversation all the time that it's like, I'm really concerned I'm not going to be able to ski the Wapta next year. And the Wapta is this classic ski traverse in the Rockies, and it is changing really, really quickly. And that came through as a really big concern. And I wanted to understand, yeah, these are changing, but is there a systematic way to understand these lived experiences of change in the Rockies?
But how do you capture that change? Kate says it's not that straightforward.
And there's also a very comparatively sparse record of long-term climate data in the mountains themselves in Western Canada. Mm-hmm. So that was a bit of a limiting factor that kind of encouraged me to look more specifically at different types of data that we could recreate this story with. I used some of the financial support from the White Museum to hire actually Barry Blanchard, who's a legendary guide in the area, and he agreed to take me up the Death Trap to try and take some photos. And what I wanted to do was then delineate landscape level change and draw routes to see how are they affected. But I wanted to do them on a more a smaller scale.
Right.
So Barry took me up the Death Trap, and we didn't get very far. We were up in September of 2022. It was really scary. It actually felt like the Death Trap. It was steep, it was crevassed, there was no snow, so it was just melting water on top of the glacier. Yeah. We got about a third of the way up, and Mount Lefroy started just dropping rocks. And then Victoria kind of woke up, and there was seracs coming off, and Barry being Barry was so calm. He was like, do you want to keep going? And he said, it's probably going to get steeper. We're going to need to probably do a bit of ice climbing. And I was like, no. Like, the point was to be able to get in there and take your time to retake these images in a meaningful way. And there was just no way to do that safely.
With Kate's original research plan shut down, she looked for another way to quantify this change. And she found it here at the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies in Banff.
It says, started climb up Victoria, SW Mount Victoria, at 6 a.m. Got up at 4:30. By the time we got to the ridge, we were whited out and had to go down, a total waste. Showing signs of disorientation and poor judgment, hypothermia. But the temperature is 20 degrees, I'm in trouble.
You know those photos people take on the top of mountains? Summit registers are like the early version of that, a way for hikers to make their mark and say, hey, I made it.
So it's always been a tradition of alpine huts. I'm pretty sure it started in Europe, where the first huts were built, to have hut registers. They're kind of akin to like a historical diary of sorts, where visitors will write their name, the date, and where they climbed. In the 1920s, when the hut first opened, the registers are pretty sparse. It's mostly names and where they climbed, but they get increasingly verbose as you go throughout history, and you start seeing like bad poetry or original songs or funny stories, and from my perspective, which was helpful, a lot more detail about what they're seeing out there and the conditions of different routes. So I started by just writing down when they climbed and where they climbed to try and understand maybe the season is shifting. And then as we went later in history, particularly in the 1950s, you start seeing a lot more detail about the climbing conditions. So if they were climbing in snow or on bare ice, if they encountered crevasses that made navigation really challenging, if they saw rockfall or icefall, things like that. And so I started tracking specific details for each route.
There are two main routes to Abbot Pass. First, we have what's known as the Swiss Guide route. This is the original historic one, the most popular one back in the day, but earlier in this video, you heard it go by another name, the Death Trap. This one starts in Lake Louise through all of those tourists and up. Then we have the other route, and this one is on the British Columbia side. It's much more serene. Lake O'Hara is considered backcountry, so you can't just drive to the lakeshore and enjoy the view here. Kate analyzed what mountaineers were writing in the registers, and she found that the Swiss Guide route was actually the most popular up until about 1974. Then that trend flipped, and Lake O'Hara became the #1 choice. Kate says climber adaptations were tracking with climate data that she'd analyzed from Banff National Park's weather station. Between the years 1887 and 2022, the average temperatures increased nearly 1 degree.
I also, based on the trends, spoke with local mountain guides to kind of verify the data and say, this is what the hut registers are telling me. Do you agree with this? Do you disagree? And there was pretty general agreement among guides, yeah, we are seeing significant changes in loss of snow, ice, glaciers. We're seeing significant changes in rockfall frequency. And we're adapting. We change when we climb and where we climb to find the safest conditions for our clients.
That extends to the hikes accessible from Abbot Pass. Mount Lefroy used to have too much snow. There was an avalanche concern there, but it's actually a better climb to do with some snow and ice. So over the years, it's actually seen its safe season shrink because there's just not enough snowpack to make that summit. But Mount Victoria is a different story. That's a climb that can be done in snow and snow-free conditions and has actually seen its climbing season expand in recent years.
People don't maybe necessarily recognize how much they can learn from guides in that perspective, where it's like, why don't you go out with them for a day and just ask, how is the landscape changing? How do you adapt? How are you changing so that you can maintain your climbing practice? I'm not saying it's too dangerous to ever climb again. There's tons of ways to do it and to do it safely. And I think guides they're really well positioned to play an important role of providing that kind of educational component moving forward.
Usually, science values the hard numbers. Think the data collected at a weather station over what you might call qualitative data. In this case, people's everyday observations. But that's what makes this project so unique, because without the climbers' records, Kate's view of this mountain range wouldn't be complete. And it's a way people might be able to take that big concept, climate change, and bring it to their own level and narrow it to something that impacts them directly, something they can better understand.
It's so much more than a hike. You're up there, you meet people, you spend time. I mean, the memories I have with my dad up there are some of my favorite. This is something that most people can relate to in some degree, whether you're out hiking and you're in wildfire smoke, or you're trying to go for a ski and there's just no snow like this year. These kinds of more persistent changes in the climate, I'm hoping people can maybe see this and think about it in a more relatable way. Because when people say, oh, there's X CO2 in the atmosphere, you can't see it. So maybe finding a way that people can really start relating to this and be maybe inspired to take action.
Something to think about the next time you're visiting Lake Louise and staring at these mountains.